India of Himself. An excerpt from the novel Trinketmaster by Jessica Schneider. Gumule shut his eyes to find time had merged into months later. Peering past the vista of himself, the citied skyline of his youth glowed within the erected hum of urban lights. He knew there could be possibly an infinite number of ways to interpret the world, and as he set out to uncover the right one, he continued to marvel at the lights and the way they slanted their grace against the buildings before him. Sometimes, if his eyes lingered long enough, it became as though whole structures could dissolve any remaining shadow, and corners that would normally dim at their appropriate hour could stay lit indefinitely. Buildings, and the cities in which they dwelled, had come to represent the material, the tangible, the physical. But as for the actual, at present there stood no buildings before him save for what lived in his mind. These structures were, indeed, the psychological kind, and somewhere amid his mess of determination and dream resided the India of himself, as well as the piece of his essence he wished to retrieve. He woke and packed quickly, always preferring to carry an abundance of clothes. Weather could alter easily, and he liked to have choices. He sneered at the thought of being forced into wearing a particular shirt at a particular time, even when he didn't want. His lady loves used to tease him, often commenting how his luggage would outweigh theirs, and usually he would laugh along with them, but today he did things a little differently. He chose the minimal over the material, and left his apartment with a single suitcase. In it there existed many aspects of Gumule, many parts of himself that have yet to be shared. He never felt he'd had any sort of narrative ascribed to his life, for he'd learned early that life really held no narrative, save for whatever tale could be composed by a human mind. This is that tale. Huts, streams, children, and elephants would fill his eyes in the oncoming days. He planned to inhale foreign skies and marvel at the many bridges public transport was regularly obligated to ride. He would find temples and statues and sunlight sifting along the water at a stranger hour, as well as the durability of flowers extending elegantly and openly for those willing to see. While in nature, he often felt insulated from every sort of misery, and had come to believe that only in the city could such hardship be found. Amid such naturalness, where birds become sound, there lacked all forms of competition, and it contained no duress. Why does one wander anyway? Was it to seek for something grander and higher, or merely to alter oneself in some outstanding way? Was there an image in which he could aspire? For so long, Gumule had always felt overwhelmed and fearful of such change, even when unsure of what, exactly, that change might be. Somewhere there existed the origins of fear. Yet from where does fear stem? Was it something internal and brooding, like the earth at its very core? Or was it more like crossing a river, where the middle is unpredictable and at times difficult to paddle, yet once arriving to the other side one feels comforted and sure? Gumule was unaware of any answer, but he knew it resided somewhere in the earth's patterns, and in the rhythmic form of breath and blossom. Head, hand, foot, and heart, all parts of him carried motivation in life. Gumule began his excursion with both passion and concentration, as he refused to allow monotony and difficulty to override him. He preferred using the word concentration to the more pretentious-sounding meditation, because he concluded both were ultimately the same thing. While in the taxicab, on the way to the airport, he tried to overlook what normally would have annoyed him: an Ethiopian driver speaking in some dialect he did not understand while on his cell phone. Occasional laughter erupted while the man's head bent backwards in amusement, but nothing the man did seemed to concern him save for the angry arms and the encroaching traffic. Had it not been for this trip, Gumule might have become more anxious and unsure, thereby allowing the idiocy of some random city experience override his otherwise good spirit. After a time, the man leaned back and spoke to him, but Gumule could not understand over the open din of the outside. Gumule rolled up his window, despite the heat, and asked the man to repeat the question. "What gate?" the driver yelled, yet before Gumule could answer, the man was once again sharing a laugh with the invisible person that lived in his cell. Upon arriving at the airport, Gumule appreciated that at least the driver helped him with his suitcase, though he did so with his phone tucked between neck and shoulder. Still laughing at some old memory, perhaps. Just what conversation could be this important? He tipped the driver, who thanked him, and that was all. Inside, the airport existed as it ever had, a bustle of familiarity and whim, and how accustomed both he and it had become, always exiting and entering one place for another. He'd come here for the purpose of traveling for his many business affairs, the many meetings his company held regularly all over the world. That was it exactly. That although his job afforded him the opportunity of travel, he did so all over the world, and did so hovering there distantly and faintly, yet never really in it, per se. He used to believe that people were the same no matter where he went, and he always found it fascinating how he could go from Seattle to Milan to Bangkok without having his feet touch pavement. That was not any way to live or be or become, was it? He rarely sweat while on his trips, he rarely chose the more comfortable shoes, he rarely removed his tie. Now, in more casual attire, he felt closer to his youth than ever before, and similar to a child. What was it about adulthood that made us protest our innocence, yet also seek it? Airports carried a collective force all their own, a rumble of movement sought and a series of goodbyes. Camille grew to distinguish one airport from the next merely by the height of windows and the colors of tiles, or the ways the bathrooms appeared during the busiest hour. Men lining up from everywhere, all with the agenda of relieving themselves at that particular hour. How funny and disgusting was it to comprehend the few that refused to wash their hands following their release of both bowel and bladder. Men are pigs, Gamule continued to think, despite still smiling politely at those declining to wash their hands at the sink. The fact that Gamule did wash his hands, and thoroughly at that, offered him a slight sense of superiority, however small. Yet with the continual familiarity of one's surrounds came forgetfulness. After a time, each airport blended into another till he could no longer distinguish which city he'd departed from the one which he'd arrived. He recalled an airport in Florida that contained trees planted within the slabs of flooring. And although they were indeed real trees, something about them seemed not real, but man-made almost, as though they had been put there to fulfill one's aesthetic agenda, and that was all. What other selfish reason could there be for an indoor tree? Man-made trees. Has one ever heard of such a thing? They were sure to exist, but for what reason? Without man, there would be no cities to travel between. Man could create anything, it seemed, even rivers. Gamule had grown so accustomed to overlooking these indoor trees that he never really noticed, that is, not until isolation overcame him. Once this occurred, his depression stirred, and Gamule could not help but feel sorry for these indoor trees. For what a sheltered time they must endure, where for them there would always be a moratorium of sun and wind and life. What pity overwhelmed them! Such greenness reminded him of India, those trees he used to climb as a boy. He'd do it without his mother knowing, as he did not wish for her to worry he'd fall and break a limb. It became these sorts of moments that penetrated him, that made him feel closest to life. Then, once when Gamule traveled to Miami on business, he finally decided to peer closely at these indoor trees, and he did so cautiously, approaching them gently while surveying their stasis, their gauche lights rooted at their base, their captive soils. No wind had ever touched them or caused their palms to sway. He knew it had to be absurd, what he thought, but trees, as anything in life that does more than mere living, deserved better. After all, could merely being planted in the center of some constructed scene, where no visitor stopped by, and no child bothered to climb, be called life for any indoor tree? Somewhere, an India rustled in him.